J. Michael Moore is the curator for Lee Hall Mansion and View Plantation, Newport News. Mr. Moore received a Bachelor of Arts in History from Christopher Newport University and a Master of Arts in History from Old Dominion University. While earning his graduate degree, he taught American history at ODU. Since his employment with the City of Newport News, Mr. Moore has curated exhibits at several local historic sites and led battlefield tours throughout Maryland, North Carolina, Virginia, and West Virginia. He is also a consultant with the Maritime Archaeological and Historical Society and the Isle of Wight County Historic Resources and the County of York Historical Museum. In addition, Moore serves as the Civil War sesquicentennial. See, I can't even say that. And I practice. In addition, Michael serves as the Civil War sesquicentennial committees for the City of Newport News, York County, and Williamsburg, James City County. He is a lecturer for CNU's Lifelong Learning Society and William and Mary's Christopher Wren's Association. Moore co-authored the Peninsula Campaign of 1862, a military analysis in the upcoming Drums Along Warwick, the Second Siege of Yorktown. Michaels also serves as an editor and photographic editor for 11 books and written articles for Virginia Cavalcade, North and South, and Military Collector and Historian. I've known Michael personally, I guess, for a few years anyway. I know he's extremely passionate about the Civil War and enjoys talking about the Civil War, and there's no doubt in my mind you're going to enjoy his presentation. So I will introduce Mr. J. Michael Moore.
Good afternoon. Oh, come on now, we all need to wake up. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I was sleeping on my sofa about 500 yards from here, so this is my favorite topic to talk about, and this is one of my favorite crowds because all I had to do is just walk up the street. So probably the sesquicentennial has provided historians, those of us that are interested in it, whether we're researchers, writers, folks that live in the area, or those that have been involved in it for a long time, gives it a chance to re-examine things and to look at an area, as you said, that most of us think of with the American Revolution. However, the funny thing is that the Confederate Union soldiers that were here were better aware of the Rev War history than you would probably think they would be. And it's always ironic that you have billions of dollars spent on education, but yet somebody from the middle of nowhere on either north or south kind of figured out this is where Cornwallis, surrendered. So I always find that amusing. The Peninsula Campaign of 1862 is dominated by Fort Monroe. It was the only federal installation in the Upper South and provided a base for overland campaigns and amphibious operations throughout the Civil War. When you have the War of 1812, of course, they burned Washington and messed it all the way up and down the Chesapeake. So the United States Army decided to put together a series of coastal fortifications, more specifically one at Old Point Comfort, to protect Hampton Roads, which is still a large commercial shipping area, as well as the Chesapeake Bay, and to defend Washington, D.C. It doesn't look too good in the war when they burn your capital and the president has to leave, and only through the valiant efforts of the First Lady was some of the important Washington antiques saved. Now, they will build Fort Monroe between 1819 and 1834, and it was garrisoned by the U.S. Army from 1823 until 2011. And that sounds extremely weird for any of us, kind of like not having Peggy here. You always expect the Army to be here. And in the same way that in the Confederate Army or Union Army, you can never underestimate the power of volunteers. The places that I work at Indy and Lee Hall would not function, and I would not be here today had we not had volunteers. Now, 80 miles up the Virginia Peninsula from Fort Monroe is a city on the James River, Richmond, Virginia. It is important because it is the capital of Virginia, but today in 1861, the Confederate Congress voted to move the capital of the Confederacy from Montgomery, Alabama to Richmond, Virginia. And it would make it a target for the Union Army's efforts for the next 4 years. It wasn't just because it was a political capital, also because it was an industrial capital. It was the industrial center of the Confederate States of America. Traeger Iron Works, right along the banks of the James River, would roll 1,100 cannons in 4 years, manufacture 269,000 artillery projectiles, and would produce a submarine. And unlike the Hunley, it had both submarines need to do two things. Need to be able to submerge in order to have a submarine, but if I'm going to be on board, it needs to have the other crucial part, and that's the surface. The Hunley had the submerging part down pat, including the underground. Anytime the designer of something drowns, like you will never say never, but it will be a very interesting day when you see me riding one of those spore buffers around Yorktown, because the designer of the Segway killed himself on one of those. So you're not going to find me on one of those. Yeah. It's like the mop thing I used to clean the floor at Farm Fresh with. But anyway, they produced all sorts of things in Richmond. They had iron works that would be retooled for ordnance industry. They had the old Virginia State Armory, that the rifle musket machinery from Harper's Ferry that had been captured would be retooled to manufacture shoulder arms for the Confederacy. They also had a laboratory that was set up in the middle of the James River at Browns Island to manufacture small arms cartridges, friction primers, percussion cap primers, and all the important ordnance that you would need. And of course they have it out in the middle of the James River, because what can happen when you have a large ordnance facility? And you won't believe what day of the week it was when it blew up.
July 4th of July.
Close. It was a Friday, so that leads us to think what was the next part.
Friday the 13th.
Friday the 13th, March 1863, poof, half of it went up. When somebody got impatient, they had varnished a friction primer on the side of a board, and they were trying to do like this to get the thing off of it, and it's made a snap, and they had been breaking up cartridges in the other room, so suddenly everybody in that room went up to the roof, came back down, another explosion took them back up, blew the walls out, and the roof collapsed. Yeah, OSHA would have had a long day on that one. Now, despite frequent skirmishes in one major battle, the Union troops were held near the lower peninsula, and thus Richmond was protected. The commander of the Confederate forces on the Virginia Peninsula was none other than Major General John Bankhead Magruder. Indeed, my mentor and former boss, John Corsian, has spent a long part of his 30-year career studying that man. And we could spend the entire time talking about just his personal habits, his flamboyant dress. He looked like Custer and Pickett took him shopping, with George Patton running the store. They were into showy military uniforms. His drinking was of biblical proportions. He was at Fort McHenry, and he sometimes partied at this one hotel. Well, he had gotten kind of sloshed in between, and he knocked on the door, and it was locked. Well, the hotel was also the mail room. So he went in and collapsed and fell asleep in one of the mail carts. And when the man came in to get the mail, he realized there was one passenger. We tried to wake him up, and he was out cold in his Army uniform. So they mailed him to Washington, D.C., tried to wake him up the next morning, set him on a stool at the bar at the Willard Hotel, and he woke up and looked around, and he wasn't in Kansas anymore. Yeah. He stopped drinking for a week or two after that. That slightly unhinged him. He arrived here in May of 1861 to take command of the Confederate forces that were mustering here on Yorktown and on the peninsula. His opponent was Major General Benjamin Franklin Butler. Where you have a tall, handsome Virginian, you also have a corpulent, bald-headed, cross-eyed New England lawyer who looks like Andy Sibowitz. Kind of a... Ladies, I'm sure you can figure out which one y'all would be a little more interested in. Yeah. Butler was so you have a clash of titans, because both of them are very shrewd people. One has great military skills. The other one has the legal tenacity that only someone of that time period could have. He was the one, Butler, that came up with the idea of the contraband of war decision. Lincoln was freaked out that they would try to free the slaves because Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland and Delaware were still in the Union and they had slavery. So he had already chastised Fremont out in Missouri to try not to antagonize the middle states And there were slaves that were being used by the Confederacy for military purposes, and some of them sought refuge at Fort Monroe. So Butler said, gee, great, we'll just consider you guys contraband of war, and we'll confiscate you. And you don't get to go back to the Confederates. Well, they were all over that like a cheap suit, so they stayed, and then thousands of others would come to Fort Monroe, earning it the title of Freedom's Fortress. The Peninsula Campaign of 1862 was also the largest amphibious operation in American military history up until World War I. And this is an era when you have the beginning of the steam engines in the 19th century, but you're still using 18th century tactics with 19th century technology. So they still haven't quite, until the end of the Civil War, figured out some of the things that they need to have. The Peninsula Campaign is a story of technology. One of the first technologies that will be deployed that will forever change military history is the Battle of Hampton Roads. On March 8th, March 9th, 1862, you have, for the shakedown cruise of the CSS Virginia, Flag Officer Franklin McCain Buchanan, a grandson of one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, decided to take out the Virginia on a shakedown cruise. Now, if any of you have been in the Navy, a shakedown cruise is basically to take the ship out, tear it up, bring it back to the shipyard so you can fix it and deliver it to the Navy. His idea was to take out the entire federal fleet in Hampton Roads. And the dockyard workers are looking around like, why are we going out into Hampton Roads? You know, they're still trying to make minor repairs, and he's steaming right out in the middle of Hampton Roads. He takes on the 5 vessels of the North Atlantic Blockading Squadron, and in short order, on March 8, 1862, will sink the USS Cumberland and sink the USS Congress. The next day, the USS Monitor will surprise them as they come back to attack the stranded flagship USS Minnesota, and it will come alongside, and for 4 hours naval history will be transformed. Since the time of Ramesses the Great, wooden warships had ruled the waves, whether they were galleys, sailing vessels, or even vessels with steam. This will change naval warfare because you have ironclads going against ironclads. The Monitor is basically awash at sea. It has the first flushable toilet in naval history, and it has a revolving toilet. Well, heretofore you really didn't need to, just wee like that. But everything, the machinery and everything was below the waterline. The Virginia moved at the speed of smell. It was 269 feet long, had 4 inches of armor plate, 24 inches of pine and oak timber on the casemate. It had 7 9-inch Dahlgrens, 2 6.4-inch Brooke rifles, and 2 7-inch Brooke rifles. And it moved at about 3 knots. And I said that is the speed of smell. So they would blast away at each other, and it was a tactical draw. But it's a strategic victory for the Confederacy because they remain in control of Hampton Roads, and the Virginia will anchor off Craney Island and block the James River to the U.S. Navy. They cannot get past the Virginia, and indeed President Abraham Lincoln will order Goldsboro not to use the Monitor against the Virginia and to have the wooden fleet that is assembling with McClellan's army to remain under the protection of Fort Monroe's guns along with the Monitor in what will become Fort Wool, or used to be Castle Calhoun. Now, onto the stage from the Virginia's strategic victory, we have the unraveling of a plan launched by George Brenton McClellan. Now, George Brenton McClellan is second in his class of 1846 at West Point. Did not handle that as well as Robert E. Lee and some of his betters. What ranking did he think he should have been? Yeah, number 1. Yeah, and he was kind of the president of his own fan club. And a legend in his own mind. We have one to show Dr. Green one of the few medals McClellan ever got, and I'm sure he treasured that and put it under the bed. It said, "Carry with you the success of this campaign." Didn't get one for the Peninsula Campaign. Now, he was, however, not just a punchline for a joke. He's a very brilliant young man. He was a very good engineer. He was one of the boy wonders of the U.S. Army. He was so well thought of that when he had these 3 old field officers go over to the Crimean Peninsula to observe the Crimean War between Russia against Britain, France, and Sardinia, they sent him along with these guys for the Delafield Commission, and he traveled around Europe. He translated French textbooks into English. He developed a saddle, the McClellan saddle, that is still used by the U.S. Army today. Not that we go out in cavalry, but each mechanized unit usually has one ceremonial horse unit, and they still use the McClellan saddle. He was a very brilliant engineer, and he had paid attention to how the Allies reduced the Russian city of Sevastopol, but he also saw what happens when you go out in an open field and attack something like Fort Monroe. It's not going to work out too well for those that are attacking. He will resign from the Army and become the chief engineer of the Illinois Central Railroad, meeting whom? Lincoln, who's their legal advisor. They know each other, which is not necessarily a good thing. He referred to him during the Civil War as the Great Orangutan. Now, when we think of Lincoln, he's kind of tall and gangly. We're never going to see him on Dances with the Stars. I mean, I can't imagine him getting out and dancing with Mary Todd real well. But he was a shrewd man, and he was a better military thinker than McClellan. He didn't have all that fancy book learning, as he would say, but he had a way of sizing up in situations strategically just because he had common sense. And the fact that he was able to see what was the really important part, where McClellan got into the distribution of cookies or something like that and would forget to unlock the door if people were coming to an event. He didn't really pay attention to the larger matters. He will inherit the Union Army of the Potomac after its terrible defeat at the Battle of Manassas on July 21st, 1861. He will take over from Irwin McDowell. He will become even the Union General-in-Chief by November 5th, 1861, replacing the 70-something-year-old Winfield Scott, who had been the commanding general of the U.S. Army since 1841. He had first been a general in the War of 1812. Now, there's nothing wrong with being a septuagenarian, but this is a septuagenarian in charge of an army in 1861. That's like being 91 or 90-something. Of course, I have a friend, Joe Bruni, who was on Iwo Jima in the 5th Marine Corps, and I would be afraid for anybody if we were walking down a dark alley and they came out and tried to hurt one of us. Once a Marine, always a Marine. Don't let the gray hair fool you. But anyway, McClellan came up with an idea that was going to use maneuver and technology to reduce casualties. He did not want to go straight from Washington, D.C. and assail Joe Johnston's heavily entrenched army at Manassas, so he decided to come down and land at Fort Monroe and push toward Richmond by using the York River and the James River. The Battle of Hampton Roads messed up that plan. And it would force him to use an overland approach because he could not get the U.S. Navy to cooperate. Now, you would think that they would have enough sense to cooperate and fight the enemy instead of themselves. No. I mean, the command structure at that time here was different than today. Now, it is still the same. Lincoln and Obama are the commander-in-chief. They're the president. But in Lincoln's day, you have the Secretary of Navy and the Secretary of War. And there's no umbrella organization like the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff or the Department of Defense that puts all those agencies under one person or a group of people. No. So you had to, if Jerry's in charge of the U.S. Navy and I'm a U.S. Army officer, we have to somehow, unless I outrank you high enough and have authorization, you don't have to do what I ask you to. Or vice versa. You could be a captain and senior to me, and we don't have to cooperate. And that, to me, seems foolish. However, when they did do that, such as Grant and Foote out in Tennessee, you have them clearing Kentucky, Tennessee, and part of Mississippi of the Confederates in about 3 months, because they came to a unity of effort despite the lack of a unity of command. Now, before they began to move against the Confederates, McClellan has several things that causes him problems. Lincoln has become impatient because what is McClellan not doing with the Army of the Potomac?
Fighting.
Moving it. And it's not fighting it. What he is doing is crafting it into the army that will ultimately defeat Robert E. Lee 3 years later. I mean, we can laugh about McClellan and some of his doofy things he does, but he put together the army that ultimately ended the Confederacy. And many of his veterans later would credit him with putting that army together. He should have been the chief of staff of the U.S. Army and stayed in Washington, D.C. and had some other ground pounder that came down here and really went to work. He wasn't a field commander. Anytime you had a battle, where was he not? On the battlefield. At Williamsburg, he was here in Yorktown. At the Battle of Malvern Hill, he was on the USS Galena. Not that he was a coward, he just believed that his job was to coordinate resources and put them in the hands of his commanders. I don't think we would have seen General Schwarzkopf on the first tank going into Kuwait, although I probably imagine he wanted to be. But there was difference in a command leadership. He also was removed as General-in-Chief. Lincoln thought that he had too much responsibility. How old is McClellan at this time period? I'm 42. He's 7 years younger than I am. It's frightening. As somebody in their middle 30s in command of over 100,000 men in the largest army in American history. He thought that was enough to keep him busy. And he also found out when he got to Fort Monroe that Major General John Ellis Wool's troops that were stationed in the Department of Virginia, basically Fort Monroe, Hampton, and Camp Hamilton, and Camp Butler, were not under his command. How would you react if you're 77 years old and had been a general since the War of 1812, and you were the senior brigadier general in the regular U.S. Army, and a 35-year-old comes up and starts giving you orders? Lots of luck with that. We'll get right to it. So Wool's troops weren't even available to it. On March 17, 1862, the Union Army of the Potomac would embark at Alexandria, Virginia for Fort Monroe and Camp Hamilton and Camp Butler. In 3.5 weeks, 389 vessels will transport 121,500 men, 44 batteries of field artillery, 101 heavy siege guns, and 15,000 horses, mules, and other animals. And a partridge in a pear tree. Yeah, that is the largest amphibious operation up until World War I. And no one was killed. Only 7 mules were killed in the filming of the Peninsula Campaign. They were on a barge and it flipped over and they drowned out in Hampton Roads. Those were the only casualties. Try moving that many people through. Since they closed down some roads yesterday, my Battle of Williamsburg tour took a little bit of a different route. Now I know why Kearney threatened to burn all the wagons in front of him at Williamsburg and have the stragglers shot if they didn't get out of the way. Now, when they get there, he realizes that he doesn't have the cooperation of the Navy, General Wool, and even the Lincoln administration, so he doesn't handle rejection well. That's not something he deals well with, nor does most of us. He also gets some sound advice, though, from John Gross Bernard. Brigadier General in the U.S. Army, was the chief engineer of the Army of the Potomac, and he actually had built the Washington defenses. He said, don't go up the peninsula. I mean, I wouldn't even do that now if I had to go from Fort Monroe all the way up to Richmond on a Sunday afternoon in the middle of July. So he says, attack Norfolk. If we're worried about the Virginia, attack Norfolk. The Gosport Navy Yard will fall. The Virginia will not have a home base. Why can't it not get to Richmond? What prevents the CSS Virginia from going to Richmond?
Draft.
Yes, 22 feet, draft. It's an ocean-going warship, the former USS Merrimack, an auxiliary steam screw frigate that is made for ocean-going traveling. And it's in the James River, which is very wide, but the channel is very narrow and deep. It's not like out here where you've got a very short amount of water, about a half a mile from here, from Riverwalk over to Gloucester Point, but you can submerge a World War II German U-boat out there in 90 feet of water and still have some to spare. Now, he, however, will disregard that advice, which is the right advice to have taken, And he will move his army up in an area which was sparsely populated. And when was the first accurate maps that they had of the Virginia Peninsula?
Probably from the Revolution.
Well, that's coming up. But when is the first time we have accurate maps of the peninsula?
John Smith?
1881, when they put the railroad in here.
Okay.
And that's a little too late for what McClellan needs. However, you are correct. He uses maps from the French army. Yeah. How would you like to go on a road trip using an 80-year-old map? I had lunch at the Carrot Tree today, and Glenn's an avid collector of York County ANA, I guess we could call it. And there was a road map, and I know what 178 was. That's all what 143 used to be. No 64. There's 60. Hardly any bridges anywhere. You can't even get across the Potomac River on 301 because that didn't exist. And I'm like, wow, I really want to go up the highway carrying that thing. So he's basically invading an area using maps from another country that's from a war 80 years ago. And the problem with that map is it doesn't show the accurate course of the Warwick River. If you look behind me, that little blue stretch coming out of that nacho pile, which is actually Yorktown over there, then that is actually the Warwick River. The maps show it going this way instead of that way. So if you're moving up the peninsula and you think you're going to have the Warwick River parallel to you, that's a rude awakening when you run smack dab into it. On April 4th, 1862, 2 to 3 federal corps will move up the peninsula and engage the Confederates at Lee's Mill on April 5th, 1862, as well as they will engage the Confederates at Surrender Field. From that engagement, they will learn the true course of the Warwick River, and they will begin to lay siege to the Warwick-Yorktown line. That siege will last from April 5th until May 3rd, 4th, 1862. When they were at Lee's Mill, they will run into Lafayette McLaws. And if you've never seen pictures of Lafayette McLaws, he looks like one of the Smith Brothers cough drop folks. He's got a beard down to here, like one of the bass players from ZZ Top. He and Longstreet could have had their own Confederate heavy metal band. Jackson would have been no fun to party with. He would have not been somebody I would have chosen. However, the former clerk of court for Warwick County, William Benjamin Jones, now a first lieutenant, with just a section of guns, actually was able to drive off 2 federal batteries off the heights on the other side of Lee's Mill. Imagine 1,800 Confederates with the Warwick River in front of them on a 40-foot bluff with 3 redoubts are able to stop an entire federal corps. The 4th Corps under Brigadier General Erasmus Darwin Case was met by a sheet of flames on all sides. That's what he wrote back to his former student. Now, talk about messed up. Kayes was McClellan's math instructor at West Point. Well, you always need to be nice to your teachers and students. You never know how things work out.
How many troops were in a corps?
About 25,000, depending on what time in the war, which side it was on. Usually
3 or 4 divisions.
Yeah. And a division was made up of 2 to 3 brigades. And usually a brigade was made up of 3 to 5, maybe 6 or 7 regiments, depending on what's going on. Now, the only real major battle of the Peninsula Campaign in this area will be at the Battle of Dam Number 1. Magruder was worried that his line, when you stop with 13,000 men, 121,500 people, you're doing something. McClellan came up and he thought he was outnumbered because his textbooks that he had from France said that for every mile of fortification, you needed 10,000 men. So if you have 12 miles, even my limited math tells me that, guess what? He's facing an equal number of troops. So he's text messaging, not like this, but they're dee back to Lincoln. He needs more troops. You need to release the 1st Corps up in Washington, D.C., and we know that's not going to be released because Stonewall Jackson's doing his thing out in the Shenandoah Valley. Now, he will authorize one attack, and that is at Dam Number 1, and that's behind me. Call it Lee's Mill by accident. It's not Lee's Mill. Lee's Mill's further toward Mulberry Island. That's 6 miles to the York River, 6 miles to the James River, and it's a weak point. It's one of the few parts of the line where the Union had the high ground and the Confederates had the low down ground, and they had the defense in depth there. The units that are established there as the Confederate defenders are Cobb's Georgia Legion as well as Cobb's Brigade, elements of which have my ancestors in it, in the 15th North Carolina. They, along with the 2nd Louisiana, were on the front lines. Amazing I'm still here when being shot at. Baldy Smith was the general. His name was William Smith, but he began to lose his hair as a cadet. Never went completely bald, but they always called him Baldy Smith because he had thinning hair. And Baldy wanted to attack because he knew that they were not facing a superior number. He finally is allowed to attack, and on April 16th at 8 a.m., they will attack with the Union artillery firing, and they will drive the Confederates from the forward positions. Now, around noon, Lieutenant Edwin M. Noyes, who is an aide to the Vermont Brigade Commander, General Brooks, will swim across the other side, look around, see no Confederates, come back. McClellan is there, the 4th Corps Commander is there, the Division Commander, General Smith, is there, and you have the Brigade Commander and the various regimental commanders. This becomes important later on. And they will authorize a limited reconnaissance in force. Now, back when you were in the military, that would not have been something that Dave Meredith and I would have signed up for. A limited reconnaissance force means that we go there and get our rear end shot off, and then no one's going to get blamed except us. Instead of sending over 2 or 3 regiments or the entire brigade, they only send 192 volunteers from 4 separate companies of the 3rd Vermont to go over. And before they leave, Corporal Alonzo Hutchinson is beckoned over by General Brooks. He reaches in and hands him a handkerchief, and he says, and this is clean, when you get over to the other side, do like this. And we'll send over more reinforcements. Well, guess who was one of the first ones shot on the way over? Handkerchief boy. He's laying over there. Now, that's a simplistic way to look at that because they're over there for 60 minutes, and out of 192 of them, 83 become casualties. Oops. You would think that more than one person had a handkerchief in the Union Army. Oh, yes. You can read the Vermont Diarist, and they will say that they're waving handkerchiefs, they're waving their underdrawers. Excuse me, ladies, but those are the kind that come down to your knees. They're waving everything they can, and they do not reinforce them, even though there was every level of command. General Smith, however, will fall off his horse twice. That might explain some of that, but he was later exonerated for drinking. General Case was there and said, I was there with him the whole time and I never saw him drinking anything. His horse was on unsure ground or sandy soil, and it threw him off of it. The end result is that 83 people became casualties out of 192, and only because of the bravery of Captain Samuel Pingree were they saved. He was later awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor in 1891 when he was a governor of Vermont. More frightening of that, a young man not much older than this one over here would swim as a 15-year-old across the river at least 4 times to recover wounded comrades from the other side. And Private Julian Scott, a musician in the 3rd Vermont, will be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor in 1865. The Battle of Dam No. 1 was a lost opportunity to end the siege and march toward Richmond. While McClellan is laying out 14 separate siege batteries for the 101 heavy siege guns, what is Robert E. Lee doing in Richmond?
Defending it.
Fortifying every nook, cranny, hill, bluff, and everything. He didn't get the nickname of Granny Spades because he liked to play cards. He had everybody, white, black, and otherwise, digging. Of course, the Confederate soldiers were definitely on board with that until they found out later that it keeps you alive and it's a force multiplier to have earthworks. They still had the antiquated idea of blasting away at each other in open cover, but once you rifle muskets and you increase the firepower of the individual soldier from about 60 to 80 yards to 500 to 800 yards, that's a big difference. Being able to shoot 5 football fields is a big difference. Now,
there's several dams on that river. Could you point out dam number 1? if you could.
It's right there where it says Lee's Mill. You see General Johnston?
Yes,
Right down to the lower left of it, that's where dam number 1 should be.
to the lower left.
Yeah.
Yeah, these, right, okay, I see it, yeah.
They just misname it.
Well, there's several dams along there, and you never put a number on any of them.
Yeah, they have. I'll tell you afterwards. They have, and what Magruder will say is when he writes to Thomas Jefferson's grandson, the Honorable George Wythe Randolph, in October of 1861, he says, along this river are 5 dams, the effect of which is to back up the water along the course of the river so that for nearly 3/4 of its distance, its passage is impracticable for either infantry or artillery. Each dam is protected by extensive earthworks for artillery and infantry. Now, what Magruder does is he continues to stall McClellan and give Lee time, and also Johnston starts moving his army from Fredericksburg down to Richmond and ultimately to the peninsula, swelling the Confederates down here to 56,000. Joe Johnston replaces Magruder, who obviously does not handle that too well. He begins to start drinking heavily at Lee Hall Mansion. Not that that's ever happened, but that's usually the wine festival. Anyway, not on the city dime though. He will come down here and he's unimpressed with the ordnance that is in Yorktown because it's the antiquated guns from the Gosport Navy Yard. McClellan is bringing 8 and 13-inch Seacoast mortars that can hurl projectiles 4,000 yards. They have 200-pound and 100-pound Parrott rifles in the Dabney's front yard at the Farnholt house that can fire these shells they call flying lampposts from basically the Amoco refinery all the way down to the pub or the bridge. And they're on the Moore house with the signal flags and at the Farnholt house to adjust fire. So Johnston gets out of Dodge. And he will retreat on May 3rd, 1862 during the night after a horrendous bombardment that even Sneed and other diarists will note. And he will begin the retreat toward Williamsburg and ultimately toward Richmond. Now, before they leave, they have another part of technology. They've already used balloons. I didn't want to go into that because obviously you all have been ballooned out a little bit of lately, and probably there's nothing I can say about that. Balloons were important at least to provide some accurate intelligence, or at least to begin the movement toward fixed-wing aircraft in the 20th century. Now, they will leave on May 4th, 1862, we have Landmine Appreciation Day in Yorktown. It's the first operational use of landmines in American military history. Brigadier General Gabriel Rains will bury sensitive shells on Main Street. To me, all black powder shells are sensitive, but these were especially sensitive, and they buried them right below this street. So as they walked in, a couple of dozen Union soldiers were killed or injured. McClellan was furious. Even Rains' superior, Longstreet, was furious at him and forbade the further use of torpedoes, as he called them. McClellan was so enraged, who did he use for minesweeping duty?
Slaves.
No,
Captured veteran soldiers.
Confederate soldiers. The problem is, who did he use?
Ones that planted.
The ones that planted. So they're going down Main Street, like that, doing the barnyard shuffle down Main Street, so they finally have to run cattle through there. So it's the Golden Corral, all-you-can-eat beef brisket people on May 4th. Now the Battle of Williamsburg on May 4th, May 5th, 1862 will be the largest land engagement in Virginia since the First Battle of Manassas, and will have 2,300 Union casualties and 1,500 Confederate casualties. And will bring in to 4 people like Cadmus Wilcox, George Pickett, Richard Heron Anderson, and other Confederate commanders, along with Winfield Scott Hancock on the Union side, Phil Kearny, and George Custer, and other people such as that. The Battle of Williamsburg is a draw, but the Union are not able to capture the Confederate baggage and artillery, which are able to escape. In the May 7th, May 7th, 1862 Battle of Eltham's Landing up at West Point was a failure because they were not able to get across the roads that would have blocked Johnston's retreat to Richmond, and they're able to push through there. And of course, as a nod to our friend Tim Smith, we will say the Battle of Eltham's Landing is the first operational deployment of Hood's Texas Brigade. When they told Hood's Texas Brigade Gustavus Woodson Smith told John Bell Hood to take his Texas and gently probe the Union lines. Well, that's like telling the 1st SS Panzer Division to occupy a village and be nice to people. Not going to happen. So they go in there and full bore attack and scare Franklin half to death. And the only reason why they told him why they stopped, he said, well, we couldn't swim out and attack the boats because the tide was coming in. So the Texans would be a part of the Army of Northern Virginia up until the end of the war. Now, with the loss of Norfolk on May 9th, 1862, the Virginia will be scuttled on May 11th, 1862, and it will open the way to Richmond for the James River Squadron. The U.S. Navy will go up there and be repulsed, however, 7 miles below Richmond at the Battle of Drew's Bluff on May 15th, 1862. The ironclads USS Galena, the USS Monitor, the USS Naugatuck, and the wooden warship Port Royal were repulsed because they're attacking a 90-foot bluff that's like shooting down this hallway here because the James River is very narrow, they're up on a high angle, and it's a 90-degree angle bend in the river, and they blow them almost out of the water, and they have to fall back to City Point. Now, whether you have the conclusion of that, and later the Battle of Seven Pines will lead to the Battle of 7 Days, and with the end of Seven Pines, you'll have Joe Johnston critically wounded. There'll be an acoustic shadow where people in Richmond, such as Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis, will know there's a huge battle raging on May 31st, 1862, only 7 miles from Richmond. It takes McClellan from the beginning of May to the end of May to get to Richmond. That is why he earns the name of the Virginia Creeper. For any of you gardeners, I like the Yorktown onion. I'd like to be known as the Yorktown onion. Only found in one place, you're not supposed to pick it. I like that. But anyway, they will attack the isolated 4th Corps of the Union Army on the south bank of the Chickahominy. And as Joe Johnston's riding to the battlefield and can't tell where the battle's going on, and just sees flashes of smoke, and he'll be shot in his chest and in his shoulder. And as Robert E. Lee is riding up as a special presidential military advisor along with one of his West Point classmates, Jefferson Davis, they will see Joe Johnston being hauled off in a litter. He's not the first choice as commander. The second in command, Major General Gustavus Woodson Smith, a Kentucky native, West Point graduate, and former New York Street Commissioner. This is a logical question. The President of the Confederate States of America looks at him and says, well, General Smith, Johnston has been wounded. What are your plans? Well, falling on the ground and going fetal and kind of rolling around saying, I don't know, over and over, kind of did not fill President Davis with confidence. So he kind of looks at General Lee and you need to sort this out. And Robert E. Lee will take command of the Army of Northern Virginia and will lead it until its dissolution on April 9, 1865. He will be called Audacity Personified and will launch the 7 Days Battle on June 25th through July 1st, 1862, forcing McClellan with 110,000 men under his command against Lee's 75,000. He will push him from within 7 miles of Richmond to within 20 miles. McClellan's Peninsula Campaign is a failure, and he loses further stock with the Lincoln administration. His overcautious nature before Yorktown and Richmond is repeated at Antietam with Lee's armies backed against the Potomac River. Richmond was saved from capture, and Richmond's industries would continue to manufacture vital supplies for the war effort until the city falls on April 3, 1865. Despite command and organizational issues, the Army of Northern Virginia, under General Lee, defeats a much larger foe and remains a formidable opponent until 1865. Magruder's dance along the Warwick River is best summed up as this. The diarist Mary Chestnut said, "Isn't it a wonderful thing how Magruder paraded his 10,000 before McClellan's 100,000 like fireflies and utterly deluded him." And it cost him the campaign. Thank you very much.
We have time for, we have time for a couple of questions.
Questions?
What happened to
to McClellan Center when they were stopped? Where'd they go?
They spread out along the bank of the below here. They organized themselves, as you can see here, from basically Wormley Creek. They brought in supplies from Fort Monroe. They began digging earthworks that would basically run right below the Warwick River and go out all the way toward the James River. They would bring up supplies, and they would dig in, and McClellan's plan was basically to turn actually this old town into rubble and march out across it. But he was not able to do that before Johnston retreated. They were supposed to open fire on May 5th, and Johnston was out of here by the night of May 3rd.
So they essentially stayed there. They didn't do it.
They just did a lot of digging and in placing a lot of artillery, and that was a siege. And it was not lost upon the Union soldiers that they had spent almost a month digging, and then the Confederates up and skedaddle, as one of them say. And the guns, the only thing they were good for is to make pictures for Mr. Brady. Love that quote.
But after the Peninsula Campaign failed, what happened to the Army?
Okay, then they go up to Richmond. They will fight the Battle of Seven Pines, and they will be involved in the battle of, or the 7 Days battles. They will fall back to Berkeley Plantation and Harrison Landing, and they will stay there till about August of 1862, when they will be evacuated back to Yorktown, back to Fort Monroe. There's actually a great picture. I will move away from the camera for this. Where there's a group of Union soldiers coming through, and it's not when they're landing to come up here, they're coming back. And one of the Union soldiers gives another Union soldier who's jeering at him a universal language symbol, and we'll just go with that. And it's in the Harper's Weekly, and I own a copy of it. So, yeah, they weren't real thrilled about, and then they would go back up to Northern Virginia, where Lee will cream them at the Battle of Second Manassas. That's where Pope said that, he had come from the west, where they had already seen the rear of their enemies, and that their headquarters were in the saddle. And I think Lee said so was his brain was also in his hindquarters as well. Any other questions?
Any more questions?
Yes.
Yes, Lois.
What happened to Yorktown from 1862 to 1865?
Well, that's another lecture. I'll tell you. No, the Union will occupy it from 1862 to 1864. There will be a military district set up here. This becomes Fort Yorktown, and Gloucester Point will become Fort Gloucester. And Cage will be here later. Isaac Wister. Wister will actually launch Wister's Raid, which goes into Gloucester and Matthews in 1863 out of here. They will also have the courthouse explode because they jammed it full of gunpowder, and it obliterates the Swan Tavern on the other side of Main Street. They will push the contraband out of the camp. Wister's not a huge abolitionist, and he will push them out to what is now called Slabtown and Uniontown out in that area, and that will make some changes to this area. And they do not leave this area until the establishment of City Point, the base at City Point for Grant's army at Petersburg in the summer of '64, and that's when they abandoned the area.
So most of the Virginians would be gone.
Oh, they were gone. Or they just decided to stay. A lot of the 32nd Virginia suddenly decided that they only signed up for defend their homeland, and when homeland was abandoned, it's hard for us to think of that. I mean, Joe Johnson, when he went into Williamsburg, he'd already tried to get out of Williamsburg and had left it undefended, and then when he had to stop and start sending troops back to cover his retreat, he had to spend the night in Williamsburg, and he went up to this one lady outside, and he said, "Can I seek shelter in your home for the evening?" She said, "No shelter for retreaters." Closed the door. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
There used to be a huge fort before the refinery was built right down there close to my house on Waterview Road. Was that, and my mother says that her father, we live on Wormley Creek, had seen pilings where they had, run bridges across Wormley Creek. Are there any maps or charts of any
there
kind
are.
of stuff that you've ever seen?
The Humphreys map, and Paul Emmett Holtz and a lot of other people take mapping seriously. Battery number 1 is the one you're speaking of, and that's at the mouth of Wormley Creek. And then further on the other side, you have battery number 4.
Well, it's a little bit further back, but when they put the railroad track into the refinery, they lopped off a big piece of it. Right there
There's all
between
sorts
Waterview
of-
Road and Hornsbyville Road.
Well, that would have been a fortification to protect the roadways.
Uh-huh.
So there's earthworks all around here. You
Yeah.
gotta sometimes figure out which way they're
Well, they
pointing.
leveled that one now.
Yeah,
It's gone.
I mean, there's, Diane Depew and some of the park rangers found a British earthwork over Wormley Pond because it was facing the wrong way to have either been Confederate Union, and they came to the point that it was British. I mean, the problem is this area had been marched over by, you know, 2 different campaigns,
Yep.
and it left scars on the topography, and that's why archaeologists love being here, because you can't move without 17th, 18th, or 19th century.
You're familiar with Bruce Catton? He wrote this guy, a private in that remembrance of the Civil War, where he describes floating all these batteries up Wormley to Wormley Pond and taking them all up and entrenching them. And oh crap, we had to take them back again.
Well, several tons of ordnance is not going to be hauled over the roads that
Right.
we have.
Big
But
mark.
Cleveland greatly should be a consultant for VDOT, because he said that the peninsula's roads are infamous.
Well, he dragged
I
them.
think we
He
should
dragged them
still
all
do
the way
that.
up the hill
Yeah,
and then all the way back down.
because they had to go to Richmond. Any other questions?
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very
Michael.
much.
We appreciate it.
We have a little gift for Michael, we just want to thank you. I know you hope it's money, but,
No, it's not. Don't tax me if I do.
but this is a thank you gift of appreciation. Thank you so much for coming.
Very much.
And we thank everybody else for coming on your way out. If you look to the left, we've got some books of York County fact sheets, if you're interested in any of those, and a couple of books about the Peninsula Campaign, if you're interested. Thank you for coming, and please come back when we have another lecture.
Thank you.